Lisa Rodriguez never thought she'd be the kind of woman who'd flinch when a door slammed. She never imagined she'd memorize the sound of footsteps on hardwood floors, calculating whether they were angry steps or tired ones. And she certainly never pictured herself standing in her marble bathroom at 2 in the morning, staring at a purple bruise on her wrist that perfectly matched the shape of fingers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But there she was, 28 years old, successful graphic designer, living in a house that belonged in magazines, married to a man who smiled like sunshine in public and raged like thunder behind closed doors. The woman in the mirror looked like a stranger wearing her face, hollow-eyed and careful, always careful. The wedding ring on her finger caught the bathroom light, the same ring that had once symbolized forever, now feeling like a shackle she couldn't remove. Little did she know that in just 3 months, that very ring would become the weapon that would finally set her free. Lisa Rodriguez had always been the girl with plans. In high school, she mapped out her college courses before graduation. In college, she landed internships 2 semesters early. By 25, she was running her own freelance graphic design business from a converted garage studio, creating logos for local restaurants and flyers for community events. Her apartment in downtown Riverside wasn't much, but it was hers. Filled with art supplies, half-finished canvases, and the kind of organized chaos that comes from a creative mind at work. She met David Thompson at a networking event for small business owners. He was everything she wasn't expecting to fall for, confident where she was cautious, outgoing where she preferred quiet corners, and absolutely certain about everything. While she questioned her decisions twice. David owned a real estate agency that was expanding rapidly across Southern California. He drove a Tesla, wore suits that cost more than her monthly rent, and had the kind of smile that made waitresses laugh and clients sign contracts without reading the fine print. Their first date lasted 6 hours. Coffee turned into lunch became an afternoon walk, and the walk stretched into dinner at an upscale restaurant where David knew the owner personally. He asked questions about her art, remembered details from their brief conversation at the networking event, and paid the check without making it feel like a power play. When he dropped her off at her apartment building, he waited until she was safely inside before driving away. Lisa had dated enough to know the difference between charm and genuine interest. David seemed genuinely fascinated by her work, asking to see her portfolio and spending an hour looking through her designs. He understood the business side of creativity in ways her previous boyfriends never had. When she mentioned struggling to find clients who valued original design over cheap templates, he immediately offered to connect her with several business owners he knew were looking for branding work. Within 2 weeks, Lisa had 3 new clients and a waiting list. Within a month, she was making more money than she'd ever dreamed possible. David's connections opened doors she didn't even know existed. Corporate contracts, restaurant chains, even a small nonprofit that wanted a complete visual identity overhaul. Her garage studio suddenly felt cramped, and she started looking for real office space. David was supportive in ways that felt almost too good to be true. He celebrated her victories, brought her coffee during late-night design sessions, and never seemed jealous of her success. When she landed her biggest contract yet, designing marketing materials for a chain of fitness centers, he took her to an expensive steakhouse and proposed a toast to her talent and hard work. 6 months after their first date, David suggested she move in with him. His house in Sunset Hills was everything her cramped apartment wasn't: spacious, modern, with a home office that had better lighting than any studio she'd ever worked in. The kitchen had granite countertops and professional-grade appliances she'd only seen in cooking shows. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet bigger than her current bedroom, and French doors that opened onto a deck overlooking the valley. Lisa hesitated. Moving in together felt like a big step, maybe too big. But David made practical arguments that were hard to ignore. Her lease was up for renewal anyway, and the rent on her apartment had increased significantly. The commute from his house to her new clients would actually be shorter. Most importantly, she'd have a real workspace, a proper studio where she could spread out her projects and maybe even start the art classes for underprivileged kids she'd always wanted to teach. The move happened gradually. First, she brought over clothes for the weekend. Then her laptop and essential work supplies. Before she realized it, her apartment was empty and her entire life had relocated to Sunset Hills. David helped with everything: hiring movers, setting up her new studio space, even having custom shelving installed for her art supplies. The house became a showcase of their combined success: his real estate awards on the living room walls, her framed designs in the hallway, their photos from weekend trips displayed on expensive furniture. For the first year, life felt like a romantic comedy montage. David would bring her lunch while she worked in her studio. They'd take weekend trips to San Francisco and Santa Barbara, staying in boutique hotels and eating at restaurants with month-long waiting lists. Lisa's business continued to thrive, partly due to David's ongoing referrals and partly because she was creating some of the best work of her career. She felt inspired, supported, and genuinely happy. The proposal came. On their first anniversary of living together, David had planned an elaborate evening dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their first date, followed by a walk along the same route they'd taken that first night. When he got down on one knee in front of the fountain downtown, Lisa felt like she was living in a fairy tale. The ring was perfect, a vintage-inspired setting with a diamond that caught the light from every angle. She said yes without hesitation, swept up in the romance and the promise of building something beautiful together. Wedding planning revealed a side of David that Lisa hadn't seen before. He had opinions about everything: the venue, the flowers, the menu, even the font on the invitations. At first, Lisa appreciated his involvement. Too many of her friends had complained about grooms who didn't care about wedding details. But David's opinions often came with explanations about what would look best to his clients and business associates. The wedding, she began to realize, was as much a networking event as a celebration of their love. Lisa wanted something intimate, maybe 50 people maximum, focused on family and close friends. David insisted they needed a guest list of at least 200. When she suggested a local venue with rustic charm, he countered with an upscale hotel ballroom. Her preference for wildflower arrangements was overruled in favor of elaborate centerpieces that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Slowly, the wedding stopped feeling like hers and started feeling like an event she was attending rather than hosting. But the dress shopping trip with her mother and sister reminded her why she was doing this. The moment she put on the gown, everything else faded away. Standing in front of the mirror, surrounded by the women who loved her most, Lisa remembered that at the end of the day, this was about marrying the man who supported her dreams and pushed her to achieve more than she'd thought possible. The wedding itself was beautiful, exactly as David had envisioned. 200 guests, a 7-course dinner, dancing until midnight, and a honeymoon in Italy that felt like something out of a travel magazine. In the photos, they looked perfect together, the successful businessman and his talented wife, starting their life together in a house that could have been featured in architectural magazines. But perfection, Lisa was beginning to learn, was exhausting to maintain. The first real fight happened 3 months after the wedding. Lisa had been commissioned to create artwork for a gallery showing featuring local artists. It was unpaid work. But the exposure could lead to more artistic opportunities, something she'd been wanting to explore alongside her commercial design business. She'd been working on the pieces in her spare time, staying up late to paint after finishing her client work during the day. David found her in the studio at midnight, surrounded by canvases and paint-stained clothing. Instead of the supportive husband she expected, he seemed annoyed. He pointed out that she was neglecting paying clients to work on projects that wouldn't contribute to their financial goals. When Lisa tried to explain the importance of artistic growth and community involvement, David's voice grew sharp in a way she'd never heard before. The argument escalated quickly. David questioned her priorities, suggesting that she was being selfish and impractical. When Lisa defended her right to pursue art for art's sake, not just commercial success, David's face changed completely. The charm disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. He told her that her little art projects were cute, but she needed to focus on building their future together, not chasing childhood dreams. Lisa spent the night on the couch in her studio, too upset to sleep in their bedroom. In the morning, David brought her coffee and apologized, explaining that he'd been stressed about a difficult client and had taken it out on her unfairly. He even offered to help her prepare for the gallery showing, suggesting they throw a small reception afterward to celebrate her artistic debut. The apology felt genuine, and Lisa wanted to believe it was just the kind of disagreement all couples have when they're learning to merge their individual goals with their shared ones. But something had shifted. For the first time, she'd seen David as someone who might not always have her best interests at heart. The gallery showing was a success. Lisa sold 3 paintings and received several commissions for custom artwork. David played the supportive husband perfectly, charming the gallery owner and introducing Lisa to potential clients with genuine pride in his voice. By the end of the evening, Lisa had convinced herself that their fight had been an aberration, a stress-induced moment that wouldn't happen again. But it did happen again. And again. Each time over something different, but always with the same pattern: David's sudden shift from supportive partner to critical adversary, followed by heartfelt apologies and promises to do better. Lisa began to recognize the triggers: her independence, her success that didn't directly benefit him, her relationships with friends and family that took time away from their couple activities. The criticism started subtly. Comments about her Appearance when they went to business functions. Suggestions about how she could be more social with his colleagues' wives. Questions about whether certain friends were really good influences on her career and their marriage. Each comment alone seemed reasonable, even caring. But together, they created a constant background noise of inadequacy that Lisa couldn't quite shake. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David began to involve himself more heavily in her business decisions. He offered advice about which clients to take and which to avoid. He suggested raising her rates, then criticized her when potential clients balked at the higher prices. When she received a call from a client who was unhappy with a design revision, David spent an hour explaining how she could have handled the situation better, turning what should have been a simple client management issue into evidence of her professional shortcomings. Lisa's friends started to comment on the changes in her. Maria Santos, her closest friend since college, mentioned that Lisa seemed more anxious than usual, always checking her phone and cutting conversations short. When Maria invited Lisa to their monthly girls' night, Lisa had to ask David's permission. Something that felt strange even as she was doing it. David didn't forbid her from going, but he asked so many questions about who would be there and what time she'd be home that Lisa finally canceled, claiming she was too tired. The isolation happened so gradually that Lisa didn't realize it was happening. David wasn't controlling in obvious ways. He didn't forbid her from seeing friends or family. Instead, he created situations where it became easier to just stay home. He'd plan romantic evenings on nights when she had social commitments. He'd get sick or have work emergencies that required her support on days when she was supposed to visit her parents. He'd be so charming and attentive when they were alone together that Lisa began to prefer their quiet evenings at home to the effort of maintaining outside relationships. Work became Lisa's refuge. In her studio, she could lose herself in design projects and forget about the growing tension in other areas of her life. Her client list continued to expand, and she was making more money than ever before. But even her professional success became complicated. David had opinions about every project, suggestions for improvements, ideas about how she could be more efficient. His input wasn't always wrong, but it made Lisa feel like she couldn't trust her own creative instincts anymore. The first time David raised his voice at her, Lisa was so shocked that she just stood there, speechless. They'd been discussing their vacation plans, and Lisa had suggested visiting her college friend who'd moved to Seattle. David exploded, accusing her of being more interested in reconnecting with old friends than spending quality time with her husband. His voice filled their spacious house, echoing off the high ceilings and marble floors. When he finished yelling, the silence felt dangerous. David immediately apologized, claiming that work stress was making him impossible to live with. He suggested they take a long weekend at a spa resort instead of traveling to Seattle, somewhere they could reconnect without distractions. The weekend was lovely, exactly the kind of romantic getaway that had characterized their early relationship. David was attentive, affectionate, and full of plans for their future together. Lisa convinced herself that everyone went through rough patches, and they'd made it through theirs. But the pattern was established. David's anger would flare suddenly and intensely, usually over something that seemed minor. Lisa would be left shaken and confused, wondering what she'd done wrong. Then would come the apologies, the explanations about work stress or family pressure, the romantic gestures designed to smooth over the rough moments. Lisa began to plan her days around David's moods, avoiding topics or activities that might trigger his anger. The walking on eggshells feeling became constant. Lisa found herself rehearsing conversations before having them, trying to anticipate what might set David off. She stopped mentioning certain friends, avoided discussing some of her work projects, and learned to read his body language for signs of an approaching storm. Their beautiful house began to feel like a stage where she was constantly performing the role of the perfect wife. Lisa's family started to worry. Her sister noticed that Lisa rarely called anymore, and when she did, the conversations felt strained and brief. Her mother mentioned that Lisa seemed different during their monthly lunch dates, more reserved and less likely to share details about her life. When her parents suggested visiting for a weekend, Lisa found herself making excuses, knowing that David would be on his best behavior but would make her pay for the disruption to their routine later. The financial control started gradually. David suggested they combine their bank accounts for easier household management. It made sense, Lisa thought. They were married, building a life together, and David was much better with investment strategies and long-term financial planning. But combining accounts meant David could see every purchase Lisa made, every client payment she received, every expenditure from her business account. Suddenly, Lisa found herself explaining why she'd bought art supplies or taken a client to lunch. David questioned whether certain business expenses were really necessary, whether she was being too generous with her pricing, whether she might be better off working for a design firm rather than managing the stress of self-employment. Each conversation chipped away at Lisa's confidence in her ability to manage her own career and finances. The day Lisa realized she was afraid of her own husband was a Tuesday in November, almost 2 years after their wedding. She'd been working on a logo design for a local bakery, something fun and whimsical that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with graphic design in the first place. David came home from work in a foul mood, having lost a major client to a competing real estate agency. Instead of supporting his wife or finding healthy ways to process his professional disappointment, he took his anger out on the nearest target. He criticized the bakery logo, called it amateur work that would embarrass them both if anyone in their social circle saw it. When Lisa tried to defend her design choices, David's voice grew louder and more vicious. He questioned her talent, her business sense, her ability to recognize quality work. Then he grabbed her laptop, threatening to email the client himself to explain why they needed to find a more professional designer. Lisa reached for her laptop, trying to protect her work and her client relationship. In the struggle, David's hand connected with her face, not quite a slap but more than an accident. They both froze, staring at each other in the aftermath of a line that had been crossed. Lisa's cheek stung, but the emotional impact was much worse than the physical one. David immediately began apologizing, claiming he'd never meant for things to escalate that way. He'd been reaching for the laptop, not trying to hurt her. It was an accident, a terrible mistake that would never happen again. He held her while she cried, stroking her hair and whispering promises about getting help for his anger, about being the husband she deserved. That night, Lisa lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside her. She touched her cheek, which was still tender, and tried to make sense of what had happened. Was it really an accident? David seemed genuinely horrified by his actions. But the look in his eyes during their argument had been different, darker than anything she'd seen before. For the first time in their relationship, Lisa had been genuinely afraid of what he might do next. The next morning, David brought her breakfast in bed and presented her with a bracelet from her favorite jewelry store. He'd already made an appointment with a therapist, he told her, someone who specialized in helping people manage work stress and relationship challenges. He wanted to be better for her, for their marriage, for the family they hoped to build together someday. Lisa wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the previous night had been an aberration, a perfect storm of stress and misunderstanding that would never be repeated. She wanted to believe that their love was strong enough to overcome one terrible moment, that their marriage was worth fighting for. But deep down, in the part of herself that she was learning to keep hidden from David, Lisa knew something fundamental had changed. The man she'd married was capable of hurting her, and now they both knew it. The question was whether she'd have the strength to leave before he proved it again. 3 weeks after David hit her, Lisa received a phone call that would change everything. She was in her studio, working on a rebranding project for a chain of yoga studios, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, she would have let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. The voice on the other end belonged to Grace Williams, a family law attorney who specialized in domestic violence cases. Grace explained that she'd gotten Lisa's name from Maria Santos, who had reached out after noticing troubling changes in her friend's behavior over the past several months. Maria hadn't violated Lisa's privacy by sharing details, Grace assured her, but she had expressed concern and asked if Grace might be willing to have a confidential conversation with Lisa about resources available to women in difficult marriages. Lisa's first instinct was to hang up. The idea that Maria had contacted a lawyer felt like a betrayal, an overreach into private matters that Lisa hadn't asked for help with. But Grace's voice was calm and professional, not pushy or judgmental. She simply offered to meet for coffee, no strings attached, no legal consultation required. Just a conversation between two women, one of whom happened to have experience helping people navigate complicated domestic situations. Against her better judgment, Lisa agreed to meet Grace at a small cafe in downtown Riverside, far from the upscale establishments where she and David usually socialized. She told David she was meeting with a potential client, which wasn't entirely untrue. Grace could be a client someday, Lisa reasoned, if she ever needed legal services for her business. Grace Williams was nothing like what Lisa had expected from a divorce attorney. She was warm and approachable, probably in her early 40s, with laugh lines around her eyes and the kind of confidence that came from helping people through their worst moments and seeing them emerge stronger. She ordered a large coffee with extra sugar and immediately put Lisa at ease by talking about everything except why they were there. They discussed Lisa's graphic design work, Grace's law practice, the challenges of running small businesses in an increasingly competitive market. Grace had recently hired a designer for her firm's rebranding and was genuinely interested in Lisa's creative process. For 30 minutes, Lisa felt like herself again, talking passionately about typography choices and color psychology with someone who appreciated the thought and skill that went into good design work. Eventually, Grace gently steered the conversation toward more personal topics. She asked about Lisa's marriage in the same casual way she might ask about the weather, giving Lisa complete control over how much or how little to share. Lisa found herself talking about the early days with David, how supportive he'd been of her career, how grateful she was for the opportunities his connections had provided. But Grace was a skilled listener, trained to hear what wasn't being said as much as what was. She noticed how Lisa's voice changed when discussing their current relationship, how she seemed to choose her words carefully when describing David's involvement in her work. When Grace asked how David handled stress, Lisa's answer revealed more than she intended. Grace didn't push for details about specific incidents or try to label Lisa's experiences. Instead, she shared general information about relationship dynamics, about how successful, intelligent women often found themselves in situations they never thought possible. She talked about the gradual nature of control, how it rarely started with obvious abuse but rather with small compromises that accumulated over time until the person's entire sense of self had been eroded. Lisa felt like Grace was describing her life with unsettling accuracy. The way David had gradually inserted himself into every aspect of her decision-making. The way she'd learned to anticipate his moods and adjust her behavior accordingly. The way she'd started questioning her own judgment about everything from business decisions to social commitments. Most disturbing was the realization that she'd begun to think of David's approval as necessary for her happiness and success. Grace explained that her law firm offered free consultations for women who wanted to understand their legal options without any obligation to take action. She described the process of documenting incidents, protecting assets, and creating safety plans for women who decided they needed to leave dangerous situations. Throughout the conversation, she emphasized that knowledge was power, and having information about options didn't mean Lisa had to use that information immediately or at all. The most shocking moment came when Grace casually mentioned that she'd been married to an abusive man herself, 15 years earlier. She'd been a young associate at a prestigious law firm, married to a surgeon who seemed perfect on paper. It took her 3 years to recognize the control and manipulation for what it was, and another year to build the courage and resources necessary to leave safely. Lisa stared at this accomplished, confident woman and tried to imagine her as a victim of domestic abuse. Grace seemed to read her thoughts and smiled sadly. She explained that abuse didn't discriminate based on education, income, or intelligence. Some of the strongest women she knew had found themselves trapped in relationships with men who systematically undermined their sense of reality and self-worth. Grace offered Lisa her business card and several brochures about local resources for women in abusive relationships. She didn't ask Lisa to make any commitments or decisions, but she did ask her to consider keeping a private journal, documenting incidents and her feelings about them. Writing things down, Grace explained, could help clarify patterns that might be difficult to see while living in the middle of them. Lisa left the cafe feeling simultaneously relieved and terrified. For the first time in months, someone had listened to her without judgment and validated feelings she'd been trying to suppress. But accepting Grace's perspective meant acknowledging that her marriage was fundamentally damaged, possibly beyond repair. It meant admitting that the man she'd pledged to love and honor was systematically destroying her sense of self. The drive home gave Lisa time to process the conversation and consider her options. She could pretend the meeting never happened, throw away Grace's business card, and continue trying to make her marriage work. She could confront David about his behavior and demand that he get serious help for his anger and control issues. Or she could begin the terrifying process of documenting her experiences and exploring what life might look like without David. That evening, David was in an unusually good mood. He'd closed a major commercial real estate deal and wanted to celebrate with dinner at their favorite restaurant. Over wine and expensive steaks, he was charming and attentive, asking about her day and sharing funny stories about difficult clients. This was the David Lisa had fallen in love with, the man who made her feel special and appreciated. But now Lisa found herself analyzing his behavior through the lens of her conversation with Grace. David's charm felt performative rather than genuine. His interest in her day seemed designed to gather information rather than connect emotionally. When he reached across the table to touch her hand, Lisa had to resist the urge to pull away. Back home, David suggested they relax in the hot tub with another bottle of wine. Lisa agreed, hoping that the familiar intimacy might help her feel connected to her husband again. But as they sat together under the stars, David began talking about their future plans with an intensity that felt more like pressure than excitement. He'd been thinking about their 5-year goals, he said. They should start trying for children soon, maybe buy a bigger house in an even more exclusive neighborhood. Lisa should consider scaling back her design business or transitioning to part-time work so she could focus on creating the perfect home environment for their family. He'd already spoken to his financial advisor about investment strategies that would allow them to live comfortably on his income alone. Lisa listened to David planning her future without consulting her preferences or ambitions. He spoke as if her agreement was a foregone conclusion, as if her dreams and goals were negotiable in ways his were not. When she tried to express some hesitation about giving up her business, David's mood shifted subtly but unmistakably. He reminded her that her success was largely due to his connections and support. Without his referrals and networking, she'd probably still be designing flyers for community events and struggling to pay rent on a studio apartment. He wasn't asking her to give up her creativity entirely, just to prioritize their family's needs over her personal ambitions. Surely she could understand that children needed their mother's full attention, especially in their early years. The conversation continued for over an hour, with David systematically dismantling every objection Lisa raised. He had reasonable-sounding responses to all her concerns, logical arguments for why his vision of their future was not only preferable but necessary. By the time they went to bed, Lisa felt exhausted and confused, unsure whether her reluctance to embrace David's plans was selfish or justified. That night, Lisa lay awake thinking about Grace's suggestion to keep a journal. In the darkness of their bedroom, with David sleeping peacefully beside her, she mentally catalogued the evening's conversation. David hadn't raised his voice or made explicit threats, but he'd made it clear that her cooperation with his plans wasn't really optional. He'd used her love for him and her gratitude for his support as weapons to manipulate her compliance. The next morning, Lisa went to a drugstore across town and bought a small notebook with a lock. She told the cashier it was a gift for her niece, embarrassed by the deception but unwilling to purchase it anywhere David might see the transaction on their shared credit card statements. Back in her studio, she hid the journal behind some old art portfolios and wrote her first entry. Writing about the previous evening's conversation helped Lisa see the manipulation more clearly. On paper, David's behavior looked calculating and controlling in ways that had been harder to recognize. While it was happening, she wrote about other recent incidents: his criticism of her appearance before social events, his involvement in decisions about her work projects, his subtle discouragement of her friendships and family relationships. Over the following weeks, Lisa filled page after page with observations about her marriage. She documented David's mood swings, his patterns of apology and escalation, his methods of maintaining control over various aspects of her life. The journal became a refuge where she could be honest about her experiences without fear of judgment or retaliation. The entries revealed disturbing patterns that Lisa had been too close to recognize. David's support always came with strings attached. His affection was conditional on her compliance with his expectations. His apologies were followed by intensified control rather than genuine behavior change. Most troubling was the realization that she'd been gradually isolated from every source of support and validation outside their marriage. Lisa began to understand that David's treatment of her wasn't the result of stress or temporary difficulties. It was a systematic campaign to maintain dominance and control in their relationship. He needed her to be dependent on him financially, emotionally, and socially in order to feel secure in their marriage. Her independence and success threatened his sense of power, so he'd been methodically undermining both. 3 weeks after her coffee meeting with Grace, Lisa received another unexpected phone call. This time, it was from Tom Chen, a divorce attorney who specialized in high-asset cases involving business owners. Tom explained that Grace Williams had referred Lisa to him after learning about the complexity of her financial situation with David. Tom offered to meet with Lisa for a confidential consultation to discuss her legal options regarding property division, spousal support, and business protection in the event of a divorce. He emphasized that consulting with him didn't obligate her to file for divorce, but information about her rights could help her make informed decisions about her future. Lisa was reluctant to take another step that felt like planning for divorce. But Grace's advice about knowledge being power resonated with her. She agreed to meet with Tom at his office during lunch hour, when she could legitimately claim to be meeting with a potential client about design work. Tom Chen's office was in a sleek downtown building, all glass and steel that reflected Lisa's nervous energy back at her. Tom himself was younger than she'd expected, probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of sharp professionalism that came from handling complex financial negotiations on a daily basis. His conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and Lisa found herself imagining what it would be like to have this view from her own office someday. Tom began by explaining California's community property laws and how they would apply to Lisa's situation. Since she'd been running her graphic design business before marriage, and David had contributed both financial support and client referrals to its growth, determining separate versus community property would be complicated. However, Tom was confident that Lisa would retain ownership of her business and could potentially buy out David's interest with proper legal representation. More importantly, Tom explained how women in controlling relationships could protect themselves financially during the divorce process. He described methods for documenting assets, securing business accounts, and preventing vengeful spouses from sabotaging their ex-partners' careers or finances. Tom had handled several cases involving successful businesswomen whose husbands had tried to destroy their professional reputations during divorce proceedings. Tom's most valuable advice concerned safety planning. He explained that the period when an abused woman leaves her marriage is statistically the most dangerous time for escalation of violence. Men who had maintained control through psychological manipulation often resorted to physical threats or actual violence when they felt their power slipping away. Tom worked closely with several domestic violence organizations to ensure his clients had comprehensive safety plans before taking any legal action. Lisa left Tom's office with a folder full of information and a growing sense that divorce might not only be possible but necessary for her safety and well-being. The legal consultation had made the abstract possibility of leaving David feel concrete and achievable. She had options, resources, and professionals willing to help her navigate the complex process of extricating herself from an abusive marriage. But information was one thing, action was another. Lisa spent the following days vacillating between determination to reclaim her life and terror about what David might do if he discovered her consultations with lawyers. She increased her documentation efforts, photographing bruises, saving threatening text messages, and keeping detailed records of incidents in her locked journal. The opportunity for action came sooner than Lisa expected. David announced that he'd be attending a real estate conference in Las Vegas for 4 days, leaving Lisa alone in their house for the first time in months. Initially, David suggested that Lisa come with him, describing the trip as a second honeymoon opportunity. But when Lisa mentioned having several work deadlines that week, he grudgingly agreed that she could stay home. David's departure gave Lisa the breathing room she desperately needed to think clearly about her situation. Without his constant presence and the need to manage his moods, she could focus on evaluating her options and making decisions about her future. She used the time to research domestic violence resources, read articles about leaving abusive relationships, and consider the practical steps involved in building an independent life. On the 3rd day of David's absence, Lisa made a decision that surprised even her. She called Grace Williams and asked if they could meet again, this time for a formal consultation about filing for divorce. Grace immediately cleared her afternoon schedule and invited Lisa to her office for a comprehensive discussion about the divorce process and safety planning. Grace's law office felt like a sanctuary, decorated with warm colors and comfortable furniture that made difficult conversations feel less intimidating. Grace introduced Lisa to Ashley Parker, a social worker who specialized in helping domestic violence survivors navigate the transition to independence. Together, the 3 women spent 3 hours developing a detailed plan for Lisa's exit from her marriage. The plan involved multiple phases designed to protect Lisa's safety, finances, and legal interests. First, she would gradually transfer important documents and sentimental items to a safe location, either a safety deposit box or a trusted friend's house. Second, she would open individual bank accounts and begin establishing financial independence from David. Third, she would identify a safe place to stay during the initial separation period, either with family or at a confidential shelter location. Most importantly, Grace and Ashley helped Lisa develop a safety protocol for the actual day she left David. They discussed timing, communication strategies, and emergency procedures in case David became violent or threatening. Ashley provided Lisa with a prepaid cell phone and contact information for local law enforcement officers trained in domestic violence situations. The meeting concluded with Lisa signing a retainer agreement with Grace's firm and scheduling a follow-up appointment for the following week. For the first time in months, Lisa felt like she had allies in her corner and a realistic plan for reclaiming her life. The decision to pursue divorce was terrifying, but staying in an increasingly dangerous marriage had become even more frightening. That evening, alone in the house she'd once considered a dream home, Lisa sat in her studio and wrote the longest journal entry yet. She documented her decision-making process, her conversations with Grace and Ashley, and her hopes for the future. She was working to create. The woman writing in that journal was different from the confused, frightened person who'd started documenting her experiences weeks earlier. She was still scared, but she was no longer powerless. David returned from Las Vegas in an expansive mood, full of stories about successful deals and networking opportunities. He brought Lisa expensive gifts and made elaborate plans for celebrating his business successes. But Lisa found herself watching him with new eyes, seeing the calculation behind his charm and recognizing the subtle ways he immediately began reasserting control over their domestic routine. Within hours of his return, David was critiquing Lisa's housekeeping during his absence, questioning her work productivity, and making plans that would monopolize her time for the following week. The contrast between his behavior and the respect and autonomy she'd experienced while working with Grace and Ashley was stark and illuminating. Lisa realized that she'd become accustomed to walking on eggshells, constantly adjusting her behavior to avoid triggering David's anger or disapproval. Living without that constant tension for just 4 days had reminded her what emotional safety felt like. She'd forgotten how it felt to express opinions without fear, to make decisions based on her own preferences, to exist in her own space without performing the role of the perfect wife. That night, as David made love to her with the passionate intensity he always displayed after business trips, Lisa felt like she was watching the scene from outside her own body. She recognized his physical affection as another form of control, a way of claiming ownership and reasserting dominance after a period of separation. The realization filled her with a cold determination that surprised her with its clarity. 2 weeks later, David provided Lisa with the final catalyst she needed to move forward with her divorce plans. She'd been working late in her studio on a logo design for a women's health clinic, a project that felt personally meaningful given her recent experiences. The design incorporated symbols of strength and renewal, visual metaphors for transformation and empowerment that resonated with her own journey. David entered her studio without knocking, as he always did, and began examining her work with the critical eye he'd developed toward all her projects. But this time, his criticism went beyond professional concerns. He questioned why she would want to work with a women's health clinic, suggesting that such organizations promoted radical feminist ideas that could damage his reputation in conservative business circles. When Lisa defended the project and her right to choose clients based on her own values, David's facade of reasonableness cracked completely. He accused her of being influenced by radical feminist friends who were trying to destroy their marriage. He demanded to know who she'd been talking to during his absence, whether she'd been discussing their private relationship with outsiders. The argument escalated quickly, with David becoming increasingly aggressive and paranoid. When Lisa refused to reveal details about her activities during his business trip, he grabbed her wrist with enough force to leave marks. The physical pain was minimal compared to the emotional impact of realizing that David's violence was becoming more frequent and more casual. But this time, instead of apologizing and seeking forgiveness, Lisa felt a surge of anger that caught them both off guard. She pulled her wrist free and told David that he had no right to put his hands on her, ever, for any reason. She informed him that she would not tolerate being grabbed, shaken, hit, or intimidated in her own home or anywhere else. David's response revealed the true extent of his need for control. He laughed at her assertion of boundaries, telling her that she was being dramatic and oversensitive. He reminded her that everything she had, from her successful business to her beautiful home, existed because of his support and connections. Without him, she'd be nobody, living in a studio apartment and designing flyers for minimum wage. Lisa looked at this man she'd once loved and saw him clearly for the first time. David's support had never been unconditional love, it had been an investment in maintaining power over her. His gifts and opportunities had come with invisible price tags that she was still paying. His version of love required her to sacrifice her autonomy, her friendships, her professional integrity, and ultimately her safety. In that moment, standing in the studio where she'd created some of her best work, surrounded by evidence of her talent and success, Lisa made a decision that would change everything. She looked David in the eye and told him she wanted a divorce. The silence that followed Lisa's declaration stretched between them like a chasm. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a cold calculation that made Lisa's skin crawl. She had expected shouting, threats, maybe even physical violence. Instead, David simply smiled, a thin, humorless expression that somehow felt more dangerous than rage. He told her she was having a bad day, that work stress was making her say things she didn't mean. Marriage was hard sometimes, he acknowledged, but they were partners, a team that had built something beautiful together. He suggested they take a vacation, maybe a long weekend at the spa resort where they'd gone after their first big fight. Some time away from work pressures would help her regain perspective on what really mattered. Lisa felt a familiar pull toward David's reasonable tone and logical suggestions. This was how it always worked. He would reframe her legitimate concerns as temporary emotional difficulties that could be solved with romantic gestures and time away from outside influences. But this time, Lisa recognized the manipulation for what it was. She told David again, More firmly, that she wanted a divorce and would be contacting a lawyer to discuss the process. David's mask slipped completely. The charming businessman disappeared, replaced by someone Lisa barely recognized. His voice dropped to a whisper as he informed her that divorce would be a very expensive mistake. He knew every detail of her business finances, every client relationship, every professional vulnerability. If she wanted to destroy their marriage, he would make sure she understood the full cost of that decision. The threat was clear, even though David never explicitly stated what he might do. Lisa felt the familiar fear creeping up her spine, the automatic impulse to apologize and retreat from confrontation. But something had changed during her weeks of documentation and consultation with legal professionals. She had allies now, people who understood David's tactics and had helped other women navigate similar situations. Lisa told David that she would be staying at her sister's house for a few days while they both processed this conversation. She needed space to think clearly, away from the tension and conflict that had taken over their home. David immediately objected, insisting that running away wouldn't solve their problems, that married couples worked through difficulties together. But Lisa was already moving, gathering clothes and essential items with the efficiency she'd practiced in her mind. During safety planning sessions with Ashley Parker, David followed her through the house, alternating between pleading and threatening, promising to change and warning her about the consequences of leaving. His desperation was both satisfying and terrifying. Lisa realized that David's entire sense of self was built on maintaining control over her. The drive to her sister Carmen's house felt like emerging from underwater. Lisa hadn't realized how oppressive the atmosphere in her marriage had become until she was breathing freely again. Carmen lived in a modest neighborhood in downtown Riverside, in a craftsman bungalow filled with books, plants, and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from prioritizing life over appearances. Carmen had been waiting for this call for months. As a social worker herself, she'd recognized the signs of an abusive relationship long before Lisa was ready to acknowledge them. She'd watched her confident, creative sister gradually become anxious and isolated, always checking her phone, always making excuses for David's behavior, always putting his needs before her own. That first night at Carmen's house, Lisa slept for 12 hours straight, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that comes after prolonged stress finally lifts. She woke up feeling more rested than she had in months, surrounded by the familiar sounds of her sister's morning routine and the neighbors' dog barking at the mail carrier. The normalcy of it all felt like a gift. Carmen had taken the day off work to help Lisa process her decision and plan her next steps. Over coffee and homemade breakfast, Lisa shared the full story of her marriage for the first time. She talked about the gradual erosion of her independence, the increasing frequency of David's anger, the way he'd systematically isolated her from friends and family. Carmen listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly just providing the safe space Lisa needed to articulate her experiences. The hardest part was admitting how much she'd lost herself in the marriage. Lisa had always been decisive, confident in her professional abilities, comfortable advocating for her needs and boundaries. David had gradually convinced her to doubt all of those strengths, to seek his approval for decisions she'd once made independently, to prioritize his comfort over her own well-being. Carmen helped Lisa understand that recognizing the abuse was actually a sign of strength, not weakness. The fact that Lisa had maintained enough sense of self to identify the problems and seek help demonstrated remarkable resilience. Many women in similar situations became so psychologically damaged that they lost the ability to recognize their own mistreatment. That afternoon, Lisa called Grace Williams to inform her that she'd left David and was ready to move forward with divorce proceedings immediately. Grace had been expecting this call and had already prepared the initial paperwork. She scheduled an emergency meeting for the next morning to file a temporary restraining order and begin the formal legal process. Lisa also called Maria Santos, her longtime friend who had originally connected her with Grace. Maria was relieved to hear that Lisa had finally left David, but she was also worried about Lisa's safety during the vulnerable transition period. She offered to help Lisa retrieve more of her belongings from the house when David wasn't home, and to provide emotional support during the difficult weeks ahead. The first few days at Carmen's house felt like a strange kind of vacation. Lisa worked on client projects from Carmen's dining room table, appreciating the natural light and the absence of David's constant criticism and suggestions. She cooked simple meals, took long baths, and gradually remembered what it felt like to move through space without constantly monitoring someone else's mood. But David wasn't giving up easily. The phone calls started immediately, dozens of them each day, alternating between desperate apologies and angry accusations. When Lisa stopped answering, David began sending text messages, emails, and even flowers delivered to Carmen's house. His communications followed a predictable pattern: remorse, promises to change, threats about the consequences of divorce, and finally rage when Lisa didn't respond. Grace had warned Lisa about this escalation phase, explaining that abusive men often became most dangerous when their partners left. David's entire identity was built on maintaining control over Lisa, so her departure represented an existential threat to his sense of self. His attempts to win her back would likely become increasingly desperate and potentially violent. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, 4 days after Lisa had left David. Grace had prepared a comprehensive file documenting the history of abuse, including Lisa's journal entries, photographs of bruises, and witness statements from Carmen and Maria about changes they'd observed in Lisa's behavior during her marriage. David had hired his own attorney, an expensive divorce lawyer known for representing wealthy men in contentious custody and property disputes. During the hearing, David's lawyer painted Lisa as an unstable woman having a mental health crisis, someone who was making false accusations to gain advantage in divorce proceedings. They presented David as a successful businessman whose reputation was being unfairly damaged by a vindictive wife. But Grace was prepared for these tactics. She methodically presented evidence of David's pattern of control and escalating violence, emphasizing the systematic nature of his abuse rather than focusing on any single incident. The judge, a woman who had presided over many domestic violence cases, recognized the classic patterns Grace described. The temporary restraining order was granted, prohibiting David from contacting Lisa directly or coming within 500 feet of her person, her workplace, or Carmen's house. The judge also granted Lisa temporary exclusive use of the marital home, allowing her to return and begin the process of rebuilding her independent life. Returning to the house in Sunset Hills felt surreal. The marble floors and expensive furniture looked the same, but the atmosphere felt completely different without David's presence. Lisa walked through rooms that had once felt like a prison, now seeing them as simply a house filled with objects that had never brought her genuine happiness. Lisa's first priority was changing the locks and installing a security system that would alert her if David violated the restraining order. She also had Carmen stay with her for the first week, both for emotional support and as a witness in case David attempted to contact her or enter the property illegally. The process of reclaiming her space was both liberating and exhausting. Lisa went through every room, removing or storing items that reminded her of David, keeping only things that felt authentically hers. She donated his expensive suits to charity, packed his personal belongings into boxes for pickup, and rearranged furniture to create an environment that reflected her own taste rather than David's vision of how successful people should live. Her studio became the heart of her new life. Lisa spent hours each day working on projects that excited her, reconnecting with the creative passion that had been slowly suffocated during her marriage. She reached out to former clients she'd lost touch with, began developing new artistic projects, and started planning the expansion of her business into areas David had always discouraged. The legal process moved slowly but steadily. Tom Chen, the divorce attorney Grace had referred her to, filed comprehensive paperwork requesting dissolution of marriage, spousal support, and property division. David's response was predictably aggressive, challenging every aspect of Lisa's requests and making counter-accusations about her mental stability and professional competence. David's legal strategy became clear during the first mediation session. His attorney argued that Lisa's business success was entirely due to David's financial support and professional connections, making her company a marital asset subject to equal division. They also claimed that Lisa's allegations of abuse were fabricated to gain sympathy and advantage in property negotiations. Tom had anticipated these arguments and had spent weeks preparing counter-evidence. He presented documentation showing that Lisa's business had been profitable before her marriage and that her talent and hard work, not David's connections, were responsible for her success. He also had financial records proving that Lisa had contributed equally to the marital assets through her business income. More importantly, Tom had prepared a comprehensive response to David's attempts to minimize the abuse. He presented the court with Lisa's detailed journal entries, medical records documenting injuries, and testimony from friends and family members who had witnessed changes in Lisa's behavior during her marriage. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic psychological and physical abuse that had escalated over time. The mediation process revealed the full extent of David's vindictiveness. When it became clear that he couldn't intimidate Lisa into returning or accepting an unfavorable settlement, he began actively sabotaging her business relationships. He contacted several of her major clients, spreading false rumors about her reliability and professional competence. He also attempted to poach her employees by offering them positions with his real estate company. These tactics backfired spectacularly. Lisa's clients, many of whom had worked with her for years, were appalled by David's unprofessional behavior. Instead of questioning Lisa's abilities, they rallied around her, offering letters of support and additional projects to help her weather the difficult transition period. David's attempts to destroy her reputation actually strengthened her professional relationships and generated new business opportunities. The most challenging aspect of the divorce process wasn't the legal complications or financial negotiations. It was learning to trust her own judgment again. Months of psychological manipulation had left Lisa second-guessing every decision, constantly seeking external validation for choices she'd once made confidently. Carmen, Maria, and her legal team became crucial sources of support as Lisa gradually rebuilt her confidence and independence. Therapy with Dr. Maria Santos, a counselor specializing in domestic violence recovery, helped Lisa understand the long-term psychological impact of her abusive marriage. Dr. Santos explained that healing from emotional abuse often took longer than recovering from physical injuries because the damage to self-esteem and decision-making abilities was more subtle and pervasive. Through therapy, Lisa began to understand how David's manipulation had worked. He had systematically undermined her confidence while positioning himself as her primary source of validation and support. By isolating her from other relationships and gradually taking control of various aspects of her life, he had created a situation where leaving felt impossible and staying felt like the only rational choice. Dr. Santos helped Lisa develop strategies for recognizing and countering the negative thought patterns David had instilled. When Lisa caught herself questioning her abilities or seeking approval for normal decisions, she learned to pause and ask whether that doubt was based on realistic assessment or internalized criticism from her ex-husband. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 8 months, with David's legal team employing every possible delay tactic and frivolous motion. But each month of independence made Lisa stronger and more confident in her decision to leave. She watched David's desperation increase as his attempts to regain control failed, and she began to see him as a pitiful figure rather than a threatening one. The final settlement was more favorable than Lisa had dared to hope. She retained full ownership of her graphic design business, received temporary spousal support to help with the transition, and kept the house in Sunset Hills along with most of the marital assets. David's attempts to claim credit for her professional success had been thoroughly debunked, and his abusive behavior had cost him credibility with the court. But the most valuable outcome wasn't financial. It was the profound sense of personal empowerment Lisa gained through the process of standing up for herself and refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. She had faced down a man who had once seemed all-powerful and discovered that his control over her had been largely an illusion maintained by her own fear and self-doubt. The morning Lisa's divorce was finalized, she woke up in her own bed, in her own house, with no one to answer to but herself. The legal document declaring the dissolution of her marriage sat on her nightstand, official and final, but the emotional reality of her freedom was still sinking in. For the first time in 3 years, she could make plans for her day, her week, her future, without considering anyone else's preferences or expectations. The house in Sunset Hills looked completely different now. Lisa had sold most of the expensive furniture David had chosen, replacing it with pieces that reflected her own taste and budget. The marble floors remained, but they were now covered with colorful rugs Lisa had selected during weekend trips to local art fairs. The walls displayed her own artwork instead of David's status symbols, and every room felt alive with her personality rather than sterile with his perfectionism. Her studio had become the heart of her new life. The space where she'd once felt trapped and criticized was now a sanctuary of creativity and independence. Lisa had expanded into the room that had once been David's home office, creating a proper gallery wall for her paintings and a comfortable seating area where she could meet with clients or simply sit and think. The transformation of that space felt symbolic of her own metamorphosis from victim to survivor to thriver. The first few months after the divorce were a period of intense self-discovery. Lisa realized how many of her daily habits and preferences had been shaped by David's demands and expectations. She had to relearn simple things like what she enjoyed eating for breakfast, what time she preferred to go to bed, what kind of music she liked to listen to while working. The process was sometimes overwhelming but ultimately exhilarating. Her business flourished in ways that surprised everyone, including Lisa herself. Without David's constant criticism and interference, her creative confidence returned with a vengeance. She began taking on more artistic projects, the kind of work that fed her soul even if it didn't always pay as well as corporate branding contracts. A local gallery featured her paintings in a group show, and 3 pieces sold on opening night. More importantly, Lisa discovered that her business success had never been dependent on David's connections. Many of her best clients had come through her own networking efforts, her portfolio website, and referrals from satisfied customers. The professional relationships David had claimed credit for were actually built on Lisa's talent and reliability. not his influence. This realization was both validating and infuriating. She mourned the years of self-doubt and gratitude she'd wasted on a man who had been taking credit for her own achievements. 5 years after walking away from the marble floors and designer furniture that had become her prison, Lisa Rodriguez stood at the podium of the United Nations headquarters in New York City, addressing delegates from around the world about domestic violence prevention. The woman who had once whispered apologies for existing too loudly in her own home now spoke with clarity and conviction to an audience of world leaders, activists, and survivors. The journey to this moment had been longer and more complex than Lisa could have imagined during those early days of sleeping on Carmen's couch and wondering if she'd ever feel safe again. Her work with the California Coalition Against Domestic Violence had caught international attention, leading to collaborations with organizations across 6 continents. The Invisible Chains campaign had been adapted for use in 12 languages, helping women in cultures vastly different from her own recognize the universal patterns of abuse and control. Standing at that podium, Lisa wore a simple black dress. She'd designed herself, adorned with a small pin featuring the campaign's symbol. The pin had been a gift from survivors in Kenya who had used the materials to escape forced marriages and establish economic independence. The international reach of her work still amazed Lisa, reminding her that healing from trauma could become a force for global change when channeled into purposeful action. The speech Lisa delivered that day wasn't about statistics or policy recommendations, though she'd included both. Instead, she spoke about the moment of choice that every survivor faced, the instant when fear transforms into determination and silence becomes voice. She talked about the wedding ring that had marked her lowest point and how that symbol of possession had ultimately catalyzed her liberation. The delegates listened with the kind of attention that comes when someone speaks truth that resonates beyond cultural and linguistic boundaries. Lisa's story wasn't unique to American suburbia or Western marriage customs. It reflected patterns of power and control that existed in every society, every economic class, every corner of the world. Her message was simple but revolutionary: no one deserves to live in fear, and transformation is always possible for those brave enough to seek it. After her speech, Lisa was approached by Dr. Amara Okafor, a Nigerian physician who ran shelters for women escaping gender-based violence in Lagos. Dr. Okafor invited Lisa to visit Nigeria and help adapt her programs for African contexts, an opportunity that would expand Lisa's understanding of how abuse manifested across different cultural frameworks while maintaining its essential characteristics of domination and control. The invitation represented the kind of meaningful work Lisa had discovered was possible when personal healing aligned with professional purpose. Every project, every collaboration, every speaking engagement felt like another way of ensuring that her suffering had served a larger purpose. The pain hadn't been pointless, it had become the foundation for preventing others from experiencing similar trauma. Back in Sacramento, Lisa's personal life had found its own rhythm of contentment and growth. Jonathan had proposed 6 months earlier, presenting her with a ring that was everything David's had not been, chosen together, representing partnership rather than ownership, and offered with the understanding that her answer could be no without consequences. Lisa had said yes, not from desperation or social pressure, but from genuine excitement about building a future with someone who respected her autonomy while sharing her values. Their wedding was everything Lisa's first marriage hadn't been. Small, intimate, focused on the people who mattered most rather than impressing business associates. Carmen served as maid of honor, Maria read a poem she'd written about friendship and resilience, and Dr. Vasquez officiated the ceremony after getting ordained online specifically for the occasion. The celebration felt like a gathering of family. Chosen rather than inherited, people who had supported Lisa's journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The contrast with her first wedding was profound and healing. Where David had controlled every detail to create the impression of success, Lisa and Jonathan made decisions together based on what would bring them joy and meaning. Where her first marriage had felt like performance art designed for social media and business networking, this celebration was authentic expression of love and commitment between equals. The house Lisa and Jonathan shared was a restored craftsman bungalow in Sacramento's Arts District, filled with Lisa's paintings, Jonathan's photography, and furniture chosen for comfort rather than status. The studio space was larger than any Lisa had ever had, with north-facing windows that provided perfect light for both her design work and personal artwork. Jonathan had built custom storage solutions for her art supplies, understanding that creativity was essential to Lisa's well-being and identity. Their home had become a gathering place for a community of artists, activists, and advocates who shared their commitment to social justice and creative expression. Monthly dinner parties brought together domestic violence survivors, legal professionals, teachers, social workers, and artists for conversations that nourished both personal relationships and professional collaborations. The house buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from people who understand their work as calling rather than just career. Lisa's relationship with Jonathan had taught her the difference between healthy interdependence and codependency, between supportive partnership and controlling manipulation. Jonathan encouraged her international travel for work, celebrated her professional achievements without trying to claim credit, and maintained his own friendships and interests without jealousy or possessiveness. Their relationship enhanced both their individual identities rather than requiring either to diminish themselves for the other's comfort. The financial independence Lisa had fought so hard to achieve remained crucial to her sense of security and self-worth. Her salary from the coalition, combined with consulting fees and speaking honoraria, provided more than enough to maintain her chosen lifestyle while contributing to causes she cared about. She'd established a scholarship fund for women leaving abusive relationships who wanted to pursue education or start businesses, using money that felt meaningful rather than spending on status symbols that impressed strangers. Lisa's artistic practice had evolved alongside her advocacy work, with many of her paintings exploring themes of transformation, resilience, and the complexity of healing from trauma. A gallery in San Francisco had given her a solo exhibition, titled Breaking Chains, featuring work created during different phases of her journey from marriage through divorce to recovery and beyond. The paintings sold quickly, with proceeds supporting domestic violence organizations across California. The art-making process continued to be therapeutic for Lisa, providing a way to process emotions and experiences that couldn't be fully expressed through words or professional presentations. Her studio time was sacred, a daily practice of creativity that kept her connected to the parts of herself that had survived David's attempts at destruction. The woman who painted in that studio was the same person who had created art as a child, before learning to question her instincts or seek approval for her creative choices. Carmen had married her longtime partner the previous year, and Lisa had been honored to serve as matron of honor in a ceremony that celebrated love without possession, partnership without domination. Watching her sister commit to someone who respected her independence while offering genuine partnership reminded Lisa how far their family had come from the patterns of dysfunction that had shaped their childhoods. The sisters' relationship had deepened through shared understanding of what healthy love looked like, both having learned to choose partners who enhanced rather than diminished their individual strengths. Their monthly brunches had become opportunities to check in about relationships, work challenges, and personal growth, maintaining the connection that had sustained Lisa through her darkest periods. Maria remained one of Lisa's closest friends, their bond strengthened by the knowledge that Maria's intervention had quite literally saved Lisa's life. Maria had recently been promoted to Director of Social Services for Riverside County, a position that allowed her to implement systemic changes in how the county responded to domestic violence cases. Their friendship had evolved from college camaraderie to professional collaboration to deep sisterhood forged through crisis and triumph. Dr. Vasquez had become more than Lisa's therapist. She was a mentor and friend who continued to provide guidance as Lisa navigated the complexities of using personal trauma for public good. Their sessions had evolved from crisis intervention to maintenance therapy to consultation about how to sustain advocacy work without re-traumatizing oneself. Dr. Vasquez often used Lisa's journey as a case study when training other therapists who worked with domestic violence survivors. The ripple effects of Lisa's advocacy work continued to surprise and humble her. She regularly received messages from women who had recognized abuse in their own relationships after encountering her campaigns or hearing her speak. Some had left dangerous situations and rebuilt their lives, others had learned to recognize warning signs before becoming seriously involved with controlling partners. Each story reminded Lisa that healing from personal trauma could become a force for preventing others from experiencing similar harm. One particularly meaningful letter had come from a woman in rural Montana who had seen Lisa's TED Talk online and recognized her husband's behavior as abusive for the first time. The woman had used resources from Lisa's website to create a safety plan, leave her marriage, and relocate with her children to a state where her ex-husband couldn't find them. She was now working as a victim advocate herself, having discovered that her experience surviving abuse had prepared her to help others navigate similar challenges. Lisa's work had also influenced changes in how domestic violence was addressed within legal and social service systems. Her collaboration with law enforcement agencies had led to improved training for officers responding to domestic violence calls, while her work with family courts had resulted in better screening tools for identifying abuse in custody cases. The intersection of personal experience and professional expertise had given Lisa unique insights that proved valuable for improving institutional responses to domestic violence. The international expansion of Lisa's work had introduced her to survivors from vastly different cultural contexts, all of whom shared the common experience of having their autonomy systematically undermined by intimate partners. Working with women from Afghanistan, Somalia, Guatemala, and dozens of other countries had deepened Lisa's understanding of how abuse transcended cultural boundaries while manifesting in culturally specific ways. These collaborations had also challenged Lisa to examine her own assumptions about recovery and empowerment, learning from women whose definitions of independence looked different from her own but were equally valid. The work had broadened her perspective on what survival could look like, expanding her advocacy beyond the Western model of individual independence to include approaches that emphasized community support and collective healing. The documentary film about Lisa's story and work had premiered at Sundance Film Festival the previous month, earning critical acclaim and sparking conversations about domestic violence in communities that might not otherwise engage with the issue. The filmmakers had been careful to focus on Lisa's transformation and advocacy rather than sensationalizing her abuse, creating a narrative that inspired action rather than voyeuristic sympathy. The film's impact had been immediate and widespread, with domestic violence hotlines reporting increased calls during its theatrical release and organizations across the country requesting Lisa's assistance with their own advocacy campaigns. The visibility was sometimes overwhelming, but Lisa had learned to use media attention strategically, always steering conversations toward resources and solutions rather than dwelling on the traumatic details of her personal history. One of the most rewarding aspects of Lisa's new prominence was the opportunity to mentor other survivors who wanted to transform their experiences into advocacy work. She developed a formal program through the coalition that provided training, support, and resources for survivors interested in public speaking, policy work, or direct service provision. The program had graduated over 200 advocates, all of whom were making meaningful contributions to domestic violence prevention and intervention in their communities. Lisa's relationship with Jonathan had provided a daily reminder that healthy love was possible after abuse, that trust could be rebuilt, and that intimacy didn't require the surrender of individual identity. Their partnership modeled the kind of relationship Lisa had learned was possible when both people brought their authentic selves to the connection rather than trying to fulfill predetermined roles or expectations. The couple had decided not to have children, a choice Lisa had initially worried about making. Her experience with David had temporarily convinced her that she might be too damaged for motherhood, but therapy had helped her understand that her decision was based on genuine preference rather than trauma-induced fear. She and Jonathan found fulfillment in mentoring young artists and advocates, serving as chosen family for people who needed guidance and support. The 10th anniversary of Lisa's divorce from David was approaching, and she'd been invited to speak at a conference about the long-term impacts of domestic violence on survivors' lives. The invitation had prompted reflection on how completely her life had transformed, not just in obvious ways like career and location, but in fundamental aspects of how she moved through the world. The woman who would speak at that conference bore little resemblance to the frightened person who had once hidden bruises under makeup and apologized for existing too loudly in her own home. Lisa had reclaimed not just her physical safety but her voice, her creativity, her capacity for joy, and her sense of purpose. The transformation was so complete that sometimes she struggled to remember what it had felt like to live in constant fear of another person's mood. Yet Lisa was careful not to romanticize her journey or suggest that recovery from abuse was simple or linear. She'd experienced setbacks, moments of doubt, periods when the work felt too difficult to continue. The difference was that she'd learned to seek support during challenging times rather than hiding her struggles, and she'd developed enough self-awareness to recognize when she needed professional help, friend time, or simply space to process difficult emotions. The speaking engagement that had brought Lisa to the United Nations was part of a larger initiative to develop international protocols for addressing domestic violence, particularly in refugee and displaced populations. Her expertise in communication and survivor services had proven valuable for designing interventions that could be adapted across cultural and linguistic boundaries while respecting local customs and resources. The work was challenging but deeply meaningful, representing the kind of global impact Lisa had never imagined possible during those early days of rebuilding her life one small step at a time. Each project, each collaboration, each success felt like another way of ensuring that her suffering had served a larger purpose, that the years of pain and recovery had produced something valuable for other women facing similar challenges. As Lisa prepared to leave New York and return to Sacramento, she reflected on the long journey from the marble floors of Sunset Hills to the podium of the United Nations. The distance wasn't just geographical, it represented a complete transformation in how she understood her own worth, capabilities, and purpose. The wedding ring that had once symbolized ownership and control had ultimately led to her discovery of authentic power and meaningful work. The flight home gave Lisa time to process the overwhelming experience of addressing world leaders about issues that had once felt too personal and shameful to discuss with anyone. The contrast reminded her how completely shame could be transformed into strength when survivors found their voices and used their experiences to help others. Her story was no longer a source of embarrassment but a tool for education and empowerment. Jonathan met Lisa at the Sacramento airport, and their embrace reminded her that she was returning not just to a place but to a life filled with love, purpose, and genuine partnership. The house they shared, the work they both did, the community they built together represented everything Lisa had learned was possible when someone refused to accept unacceptable treatment and committed to creating something better. That evening, as Lisa sat in her studio working on a new painting, she thought about all the women who might encounter her story and recognize their own experiences in her journey. The artwork she was creating depicted hands breaking free from chains, but the chains were made of flowers rather than metal, representing how abuse often disguised itself as love, care, or protection. The painting would become part of a new campaign targeting young women before they entered relationships, helping them recognize warning signs and maintain their autonomy from the beginning. The work was never finished, would never be finished, as long as women continued to suffer abuse and control in intimate relationships. But each campaign, each survivor who found her voice, each policy change that better protected vulnerable people represented progress toward a world where Lisa's story would be unnecessary because abuse would be recognized and stopped before it escalated to dangerous levels. Lisa's journey from victim to survivor to international advocate proved that the most painful experiences could become sources of tremendous power when channeled into purposeful action. The wedding ring that had once felt like a shackle had ultimately led to her liberation, and her refusal to remain silent about her experiences had created ripple effects of healing and empowerment that continued to expand around the world. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space now claimed her place confidently, knowing that her voice, her story, and her work mattered. The transformation was complete not because the pain had been erased, but because it had been alchemized into something that served life rather than diminishing it. Lisa Rodriguez had not just survived, she had thrived, and her thriving had become a beacon of hope for countless other women seeking their own paths to freedom and fulfillment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.